believe was an assassination also, because I had the privilege of interviewing someone who was there when they raised the plane. And you may wonder why you never saw pictures of that airplane, and one of the biggest, probably the biggest news story of the year, and yet when they raised the plane the following week, we never saw any pictures of it. I was in Australia, incidentally, when that happened, July 16th last year, and I immediately sent an email to two friends, one on the West Coast and one on the East Coast, and I asked them both, is there any reason for me to believe that this was anything other than an accident? And both wrote me back and said at that time, which was that Saturday, the next day, that they had no reason to believe anything other than what they were seeing on the news. And of course I was getting CNN off the satellite over there. But they sure were fed up with the inundation of all the Kennedy legacy and history and everything that you were apparently force-fed for the next several days. I have determined since, after coming home and going to Martha's Vineyard and doing a private investigation on the whole case, I believe that you were force-fed that information all weekend for the simple reason that the media could not afford to tell you the facts of the case as they knew it. I was a little perplexed that the CIA was involved in that investigation. And I heard that on CNN when I was still overseas, halfway around the world, just a day or two later. And I said, CIA, what are they doing, number one, involved in a domestic investigation, and number two, in a civilian, a search for a civilian aircraft? Neither one of these kind of meshed. I think it did make sense to me, though, on Monday when the Coast Guard called off the search for young Kennedy, because that's customary, as I'm sure you know, after 72 hours, the people are presumed dead. And yet the President of the United States called the search right back on just an hour or two later. I maintain that Bill Clinton did that because he wanted to be doggone sure that his forces found that plane and not somebody else a year or two later, because I was told by the man on the scene that the tail had been blown out of the plane, the fuselage was black, the bodies were charred, and they were dead before they hit the water. I will go into more details on that and let you form your own opinions when I have an opportunity to do a whole hour on that subject matter, but I did want you to know that we'll be talking about that later in the weekend. I thought I'd take in the next half hour or so and maybe introduce myself to you and what I do. I began my writing career at late middle age, I guess, and about 13 years ago in 1987 I wrote a book called The Banksters, and I wrote it under the pen name of Pat Riot, acronym for Patriot. And it's a short, maybe some of you have seen it, it's about 110 or 12 pages on a primer on the twin sisters of deception, I call them, the Federal Reserve and the Internal Revenue Service, both of which were formed in the same year and foisted upon us. Most people, though, today, especially those who talk about the waste of taxpayers' money, lead me to believe very quickly that they really don't have a grip on the situation, understand the money issue and the tax issue at all. You see, there is no taxpayers' money in this country. It's all government money. There's been no taxpayers' money since June the 24th, 1968, the day the banker's window slammed shut on your Federal Reserve notes to redeem them for silver coin. From that moment on, we had 100% inflation in this country. And now stop and think, if the government can create all the money it wants for nothing, called deficit spending, through credit and paper, and pay anything they need to pay with it, then why would they need your income tax money to operate? Of course they don't. The income tax must be portrayed. It is a charade on the people. You must believe that you are supporting government, because what fool is going to pay it if he finds out the truth? So understand, if the government creates all the money from the top and it rains down through the bureaucracy in the form of government checks and then is loaned to the farmers and merchants and other people through the 16,000 commercial banks around the country, loaned, imaginary money loaned at imaginary interest, boy, what a game that is, then eventually you're going to have a flood of credit building up, aren't you? Just as Brazil and Mexico and other countries did. There is the purpose of your income tax. It's really a dual purpose. One purpose is to keep a dossier on every American citizen So they know exactly what property you own because you're foolish enough to tell them when you fill out the 1040. They know where your bank account is. They know how much money you earned last year. They know everything about all your assets. And so when you step out of line as one of the king's little subjects, and you declared yourself one of his subjects when you filled out the form and sent it in, now when you step out of line and don't pay, they know where to go to capture your assets and snap you back in line. Now occasionally, only a couple of hundred a year actually go to behind bars. But they have determined that that couple of hundred is enough to keep the other 100 million tax filers in line. It's called a fear factor. Well, people are wising up. The education is growing, and really that's why I'm here tonight, because I was driven out of business by the IRS, or actually by the corporation that bent over to a notice of levy and allowed them to allowed the IRS to take my money, or at least they gave it away. Now that situation's not over, but instead of working for the IRS, I just decided to retire and begin writing. And so my first book was The Banksters in 1987, and then in 1992 I wrote a book called I Rode with Tupper, and that was a story of Tupper Saucy. Here's the cover. It's a lot more than Tupper Saucy story. How many here have ever heard of Tupper Saucy? Does that name, I thought it would probably mean something to a few of you. Tupper was a publisher, for those of you who don't know his name, in Tennessee, in Sewanee, Tennessee, back in the 80s. Prior to that, he was a songwriter, he was a playwright, he was a school teacher, he is an advertising man, very successful advertising agency in Nashville. But he took a great interest in the Constitution in the late 70s and the whole tax movement. And he wrote a book called The Miracle on Main Street in 1980, which was a fabulous little essay on money. And it's written so well that an 8th grade child can understand the money issue and the reason for gold and silver coin. Now, most adults today in this country do not know the reason for gold and silver coin and why it's a necessity to your freedom, because we've been deceived so much by the news media propaganda once again. But stop and think. One of the founders, Jefferson, and several of the others agreed that whenever public servants begin to be paid by something other than what the people produce, the roles of master and servant become reversed. And so when we had circulating gold and silver coin in the country, it was something that was produced by us, and we controlled government. Now, if I have a cow and you have 6 chickens, and I need some eggs and you need some milk or meat, so we decide to make a trade, your 6 chickens are not worth what my cow is. So I need some equity. I need something to make this thing an equitable trade. So I'll take your hog, or I'll take maybe some diamonds that if you've got that, or have you got any crop that's come in where I can use some? Oh, how about some gold and silver coin? That deal, we can make a trade with that. Yeah, we can make you change with that. You see, throughout history, those two metals have been determined to be the most durable, the best storehouse of value. They always maintain a scarcity. And so there are many things that we could use, any of which would be better than imaginary credit, computer bleeps that we've got now in a monetary system that can be created by the mafia that controls it. That mafia just happens to be the United States government today in our lives, but nevertheless, you see, did you know it was a capital offense 200 years ago at the founding of this nation? It was a capital offense punished by death to counterfeit gold or silver coin. That's how important that was to the founders. Today, there's no such thing on the books as counterfeiting. If you look in your federal statutes, you'll see it's called illegal counterfeiting. Because I guess they figured some smart ass like me would come along and take them to task and say, hey, you guys are counterfeiting. Well, our counterfeiting is legal. Yours is illegal. And so if we catch you doing it in the basement, you're going to jail, Buster, but we get to do it. I mean, of course they don't say those things, but if you look at the law, you'll see that's exactly what they are doing. And look up the definition in Black's Law of counterfeiting, and it will, it'll blow your gourd on what the guys are getting away with. But all this was done through legal tender. We have been captured by a 10-square-mile nation called District of Columbia, up there above Virginia and west of Maryland and south of Pennsylvania, because that's what the Constitution restricted them to, 10 square miles. That's all they were supposed to get. And we held them down pretty well for the first 150 years when we had lawful money. Lawful money is defined just as a dollar is defined in the Coinage Act, and these laws have never been rescinded, they've never been amended. Article 1, Section 10 of your Constitution says, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. What part of that do you not understand, Mr. Congressman? No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. The 1792 Coinage Act defined a dollar as a measurement of gold and silver. Did you know that? That little piece of paper in your wallet is not a dollar. It's a token. A dollar, by law, is a measurement. It's 25.8 grains of gold, or it's 412.5 grains of silver. Deuteronomy 25, 13 through 15, God admonishes us to maintain a just system of honest weights and measures. And that's what we had in this country until the Fed came along. The United States Code, 12 USC 152 says the terms lawful money or lawful money of the United States shall be construed to mean gold and silver coin of the United States. That's what lawful money was. Legal tender replaced all that with the Federal Reserve in 1913, and especially Roosevelt in 1933 when he stole the gold from your grandparents and inserted his tokens. Actually, indeed he did steal the gold, because it was $20 an ounce. Remember the old $20 gold piece? That was an ounce was worth an ounce of gold. And as soon as he suckered everybody in, then they immediately in legal tender just said the gold's worth $35 an ounce, making millions for Bernard Baruch and Roosevelt and his cronies of paper tender. Previously, they had sunken the nation into a horrible depression where the people didn't care. Hey, can I buy bread with it? It's good enough for me. And that's how the Americans were suckered in. And then in 1963, because you always had your older guys remember the Federal Reserve notes that said, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money. I carry one in my wallet for coffee shop seminars. And is redeemable for lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank or the United States Treasury. That meant this was a viable, bona fide note, good for exchange on demand when I say I want it. That's where the old saying, sound as a dollar, came from. Sound as a dollar is a joke today, isn't it? But in 1963, oh, I should go back. In 1928, you could read those, in the 28 series, you could read that print I just recited to you with the naked eye. The 1934 series, I need my glasses to read it. By the time the 1950 series came along, I need a magnifying glass to read it. They were gradually shrinking it out of existence to program us to forget. And in 1963, the 1963 series was the first series of Federal Reserve notes that had no redeemability clause on it. It says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Didn't even waste any ink on a period. It's all just stamped on there. Guess when they were foisted on the American people? Guess when they slipped those in? Anybody know? November the 25th, 1963, the day of John F. Kennedy's funeral, where it would be buried on the back pages of the newspaper. And so these two bills, now we got a bona fide, lawful Federal Reserve note circulating right next to a blatant piece of counterfeiting, but because they both were done by the same mafia godfathers, we accepted them. And they circulated together for 5 years. And on June the 24th, 1968, was the last day you could take that bona fide note to the window and get your silver for it. The next day, the window slammed shut. And that's why I say, since June the 24th, 1968, anytime you hear somebody say about the waste of taxpayers' money, they're using antediluvian terms. That's an antiquated speech that absolutely means nothing in today's society because there is no taxpayers' money anymore. It's all government money. And so always remember, whenever public servants are paid by something other than what the people produce, the roles of master and servant become reversed. Now, when you understand the money issue, it's very simple, very easy to understand the fraud in the tax system. And as I said, it's coming to a head. How many people saw the July 7th, Friday, USA Today full-page ad this year? Did you? Only one. I'm surprised. Okay. There's a full-page ad in there that you're going to see more of. A lot of people have taken that and taken it to their local newspaper for reprints. It costs $80,000 to do it in USA Today. But it caused so much commotion amongst the American people that it shut down the phone lines in Washington, D.C. from 9:30 in the morning till 4 that afternoon. Blew a fuse, or else somebody pulled the plug. I'm not sure which. But nobody could get through to his congressman or senator all that day. And the ad said, "Dear We the People." And it had three subtitles. The 16th Amendment, the income tax amendment, is a hoax on American people. You can't file a 1040 form without waiving your rights, which is true to the Fifth Amendment protects you against being a witness against yourself in a criminal prosecution. So if you sign a 1040 form under penalty of perjury, that's a criminal offense, right? So in order to sign it and submit it, you have to waive your constitutionally protected rights. So here went out a full-page ad, and with about a dozen websites for them to seek it out. Don't take our word for it. Check it out on the computer. To me, the most outrageous thing in the ad was when Bob Schultz and Joe Bannister, a former IRS agent who quit his $76,000 a year position because he couldn't stomach the lie that he was living. He had, here's a man with some character. But Joe Bannister is on our side of the fence now. And he and Bob Schultz, a talk show host from New York State, went to the White House to invite a representative from the White House. They had also invited various congressmen and senators, various representatives from the IRS, from the commissioner on down. And they went to the White House to invite someone to be a representative there from the administration. And this clown writes back, "The legality of the income tax is not of high priority with the White House, and so we will not be participating in your conference." The legality is not high priority. Of course, we should know the legality of anything is not a high priority to Bill Clinton. But is that not indicative of us living in a tyranny when they don't give a hoot and they tell you in a letter that they don't care whether it's legal or not? So, but it's coming to a head. Because right now, I can tell you, we have gone to press. There is a movement by some radicals down in South Texas. It's called Operation Texas Scorpion. And Operation Texas Scorpion is going to hit Philadelphia next week at the Republican convention with some poisonous stings. They got 20,000 copies of that tear sheet that will be handed out by various militia members from Texas and Kentucky who are going to converge on the city. And also in there is my story, which is the cover story in the August issue coming up in Media Bypass. Federal officer forced into seclusion. Government will eat its own to protect secrets. And it's about a 3,000-word story I did there on Gary Phillips, who was an INS officer for nearly 20 years, the boss at SeaTac Airport in Washington State, and discovered the fraud in the 16th Amendment and began to write letters. And his reward was an attempt to be indicted by the grand jury. He wrote over 100 letters, starting with Janet Reno, who's his boss, right? And he pointed out to Janet Reno that there's laws on the books like misprision of treason and misprision of felony. And that means if I, even you as a private citizen, but the responsibility is multiplied for a federal officer, if you know of a crime that's being committed and do not report it, you become a principal as an accessory after the fact. That's what misprision of felony is. Misprision of treason, you can imagine what that is. Someone who is committing treasonous acts within the government. And so Gary felt like he was guilty of both of them because he was enforcing laws that were not on the books, and he was being forced to obey laws that were not on the books, and so he needed to report this. And see, he wrote 100 letters to congressmen and senators and to the Attorney General and to the White House and to federal judges all over the country. And he never got one answer. In 1996, his reward was an attempt to indict him, the grand jury. And I'm happy to say it was only an attempt, because they made a mistake of calling Gary Phillips, Officer Gary Phillips, to the grand jury. They subpoenaed him, and he walked in with about 60 copies of letters that he had sent to the various officials I mentioned. And Gary knows the law, and he is articulate enough to be able to talk to a jury, and he explained his whole situation, and the grand jury members said, "Bull, this guy didn't attempt to be willful." They wanted to get him on willful failure to file. He had even written a letter to the IRS to tell them why he wouldn't be filing anymore. Is this willfulness? And so the grand jury refused to sign a bill of indictment. And he was not indicted. Nothing happened, because they couldn't get past the grand jury barrier. And that's why we have grand juries in this country, to stop out of control prosecutors. Well, through the federal system, because it is so corrupt today, that the out-of-control prosecutors seem to have carte blanche at remaining out of control. Because the Assistant United States Attorney, his name was Arlen Sturm, by the way, S-T-U-R-M, when he attempted to bring the grand jury indictment against Mr. Phillips. But in 1999, Arlen Storm, the same man, according to Phillips, he saw them both, Arlen Storm took what they call an information of 5 counts of willful failure to file straight to the federal court, circumventing the grand jury system, and they dragged Gary Phillips to trial in chains. It was Star Chamber, straight out of the Soviet Union or Red China, what they did to the man. And he challenged the jurisdiction. They wouldn't tell him what jurisdiction it was. And they did a quick arraignment last year ago, April 15th of '99, significant date. And he was released. And during that summer, he acquired his individual master file. Anybody know what an IMF is? Good, good. Those of you who don't, it's your dossier. But it's written in encrypted code. And it's a private thing that the government keeps on you. It's called IMF. And in your individual master file, if you want to do a Privacy Act or Freedom of Information Act, you can get that information. But you have to be able to read it. So you'll have to find somebody, and I can give you a few names of people who know how to read it, but there are special code books because it's all encrypted. But Gary Phillips got a hold of one of their code books and knew how to read the thing when he got his back. And I have a friend in Denver, an accountant who does that also. Another one down in Payson, Arizona. You may know him. There are people who know how to decipher this stuff. And Gary quickly learned when he got his IMF back that, as he suspected, the IRS showed him as one who was not required to file. Told him right there. And then he went on through some of the other code stuff, and he discovered some interesting things about himself. He discovered that he was a drug runner operating out of the Grand Cayman Islands, hauling drugs to the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. Gary Phillips has never been to the Caribbean. But there it is, right there in black and white. He also was a manufacturer of car parts and handguns. Now, I asked Joe Bannister about this just about 2 weeks ago when I was compiling the story. I said, Joe, when you guys would pull down somebody's IMF on the computer, could you change anything in it? He said, absolutely not. He said, all we could do is pull it down and print it out. We couldn't touch it. I said, how high would it have to go for somebody to be able to change that or add stuff to it? He said, all the way to Washington. Nobody, he said, nobody at my level could do that. It had to come from a very high place. So we tossed it around and imagined that probably, it makes sense to me that after he sent that letter to Janet Reno, and she began to realize how much law this guy knew, and they knew they had no jurisdiction on him through the IRS, perhaps they better create some somewhere else. And that's what they did, making him a drug runner, giving DEA jurisdiction, making manufacturer of handguns giving a ATF jurisdiction. Now you got to understand, you're playing with rattlesnakes. These are the lowest living people in the country. I don't pledge allegiance to the flag anymore. I rather recommend we fly the flag upside down. It's not because I have any less love for my country. I've got more love for my country than ever. But our country is in great distress because we've been captured from the outside, or I should say from the inside out, but certainly been captured by a foreign government. So I guess I'm telling you, if you ever get in their clutches, don't trust them. Don't trust one word they ever tell you, because they're the lyingest dogs you'll ever come into contact with. Gary Phillips was rushed to trial. Oh, in September, before his trial, he was scooped up and thrown in a jailhouse for 40 days. 40 days and 40 nights. They never told him why they arrested him. And on a Friday, it's unheard of, they never release you on a Friday, but on a Friday they turned him loose. And they never told him why they turned him loose either. And then they set a trial date. And in January this past year, 2000, they had a trial date set, and he was dragged to trial. And he was denied 19 out of his 21 witnesses. So he said, well, okay, if you won't let the jury hear my witnesses, I'd like to call that guy right there. And he pointed to Robert Manning, the Internal Revenue Service lackey who had been sitting next to the U.S. attorney during the whole trial. And the U.S. attorney objected, but the judge said, no, let's send the jury out, and then we'll see what this guy's going to say. So they put Manning on the stand, and Phillips did this direct examination, and he asked him, well, what law is it exactly that I am breaking by not filing these 1040 forms? Guy couldn't come up with one. He looked at his feet, looked kind of stupid. Then he asked him what criminal penalties are on the books for someone, and where is that found, who doesn't do these things? Couldn't find that anywhere either. So the judge set him back down and said, no, I don't think the jury needs to hear this. And they didn't. You know, the judge is supposed to be a referee, not part of the prosecution, but I'm sorry, he's part of the prosecution today in the federal system. So you might as well know that. And so the jury came back in, and it was quickly over, and the judge gave his charge, and some of you know how that works. He just tells them to convict this guy, and they do it. Because juries are a bunch of robotons. They don't know what their powers are. They're certainly never told once they get in that courtroom. They don't know that their powers are greater than the judges. And they have the power to not only rule on the facts, but rule on the law, and overrule the law if they don't like it. But the way the federales handle it today, it's very difficult for an ignorant juror to do much more than just say guilty when that federal trial's over. You know, when I consider a federal indictment a badge of honor today, whenever I see reading the paper where someone has been indicted by the feds, I mean when there's a crime with no victim, and that's what most of the federal trials are, I say to myself, well, I wonder what this guy was doing in a Christian manner and with honesty and integrity and with character and fairness. Well, it had to be something, because he's certainly done something that is not kosher with the corruptness in the federal government. That's the way I see it today whenever I spot it in the papers. So they have become the enemies of liberty. And Gary Phillips' sentencing was set for February the 25th. On the night of the 24th, he decided it would probably be very prudent for him not to go in for sentencing. Instead, he stepped across the border. First of all, he knew he had done anything wrong. He hadn't committed any crimes. He had done everything in his world to help the officials right the wrongs and obey the law. And second of all, as a supervisor of the INS office in SeaTac, he had collared many an illegal alien. So you can imagine how quickly they would have shoved him into the cell with somebody with a knife to slash his throat if he had, and Gary's 68 years old. He's not exactly a spring chicken anymore. Well, that story, plus a whole lot more of what he said about that, will also be printed on the back of that tear sheet that's going to be handed out at the Republican convention. This magazine is hot off the press. Federal officer forced into seclusion, and in fact, his subscribers haven't even received this yet. There's Gary standing at the Rio Grande, looking across the river longingly at his former country. I got a call back in June from an intermediary who told me where he was going to be for about 3 days, and he wanted to talk with me because he wanted the truth to be out about his story. And of course, I jumped on the airplane as quickly as I could get going to get down there because I thought it was a very valuable story also. And I've known Gary since 1996. I know him to be a man of honor, and I know him to be a man of character and integrity. And I knew, I've been following it, at least on the telephone with him and in other magazines over the last several years, and what they were doing to him. So we got the story, and on next week, 20,000 of those tear sheets will be passed out at the Republican convention. I expect to see still a total cover-up from the news media, but it'll be interesting to watch them squirm and see how they do cover it up. I urge you to get a subscription to Media Bypass magazine. I'll give you a quick commercial now. We come every month. We do a lot of our own investigations. We're only $40 a year, and by subscribing here at the expo this weekend, we'll give you 3 back issues, and then give you the current issue, and then start your subscription in September. So by dealing with me instead of the magazine, you can get 16 for the price of 12. What a deal! So I hope you'll come by and look at our table and see what we got. Also, in 1992, I was going to just sketch a little bit more of my history for you before we wind down. After I had written I Rode with Tupper, I was in Kansas City living at the time, and the Weaver situation, Randy Weaver situation, broke up in Idaho, and that was August 21st, 92. And for those of you who don't recognize that name, that was the family who was trying to live alone, and the husband was set up on ATF charges because he allegedly had sold a gun to an undercover officer, which was an 1/8 of an inch too short, less than 18 inches. And on August the 21st of 92, a U.S. Marshal snooping around shot the dog and shot the 14-year-old boy, Sammy, when he complained to him about it. And then the family ended up in a siege in their cabin up on the mountainside for the next 11 days. Next morning, FBI HRT hostage rescue team assassin by the name of Lon Horiuchi blew Mrs. Weaver's head half away with a single shot from a .308 trained sniper. I've mentioned something about him in this issue, and I think that's another reason that the flag issue is on my mind, because the Ninth Circuit Court finally, just this June 14th, 8 years after the fact, came down from San Francisco saying that Lon Horiuchi was immune from prosecution even in the state system. And that decision came down on June the 14th, which is allegedly our Flag Day in this country. And so I am recommending that next Flag Day that we begin to fly our flags upside down in honor of that court decision, as well as many others. But nevertheless, it was that day that I discovered that, a few days later rather, that my friend Jack McLam from right here in Phoenix, many of you probably remember Jack, the honest cop, who does he lives in Idaho now, but he does a newsletter called Aid and Abet, and it's a newsletter for other cops around the country, pointing out to them the intervention of the federales around the country and how to beware of it. Well, Jack and I had gone back some 10 years prior to that, so we were old friends, and when I learned he was on the scene in Idaho, along with Bo Greitz, attempting to negotiate with the FBI and get the family out of there alive, I contacted the secretary here and found out a phone number where I could reach them at the cafe. They were sleeping in the attic of a cafe on the mountainside, and were only reachable in the evening because by daytime they were in the motorhome going up the mountain to attempt to talk with the Weavers. So I was talking with Jack every night, and then relaying the information on to Chuck Harder, who was a talk show host and a network owner in Florida that had the People's Radio Network. And probably many of you have heard Chuck, or maybe even heard some of my reports then or later on the Weaver situation. And Chuck quickly realized my information was authentic, my sources were legitimate, and he began to put me on the air to some 300 stations around the country, and instructed his weekend talk show host that if I should call in with any additional information to be sure and put me right on. So I was doing about 15 minutes a day on the on the Weaver side of the story, the information coming from the Weaver side of the fence. You will find whenever you read any story like this, particularly when it involves a patriot issue, a tax issue, Montana Freeman, for instance, all you get from your media is the government side of the story. They'll take stuff right off an indictment and then they'll tell it to you as if it were fact. An indictment is only an accusation. And that's what I found when I got to Montana. But that's what the Weaver side of the story and their side of the fence was an entirely different story than what we were getting on the media. So I was one of the few reporters in America that was telling the truth to the country, and I was doing so to a few million people over Chuck Harder's network. And suddenly Pat Shannon, an investigative reporter, was born. And from that, after that, Chuck asked me to write some stuff on Waco. He sent me to Oklahoma City later in '95. Went back about 6 times that summer. In fact, we finally did what amounts to a 2-hour video. I have a few copies with me on the table there. It's the most comprehensive thing ever done on the Oklahoma City hoax, I call it. The bombing, of course, was not a hoax, but what was reported to the people was a total hoax. For those of you who don't know, the building was blown from the inside out with 4 charges at the 3rd floor level, very strategically placed to knock the columns out and dump that whole thing down on the children in the nursery right under it on the 2nd floor. It was done to create sympathy for the anti-terrorist bill, which was languishing in Congress and going nowhere. And both Ted Gunderson, retired FBI special agent in charge from the Los Angeles office, independent of each other, along with General Ben Parton of the United States Air Force, a demolition expert who first showed us where the charges were set in the building. Independent of each other, they both came up with that conclusion, and that would be the reason that that thing was done. And I can tell you, it was a very, very cleverly planned operation from long before it happened until long after it happened. And even Stephen Jones was involved in the cover-up. And if we have some more time this weekend to talk about the details of that, I'll be delighted to go into it, because it is my pet case of all that I've ever looked at or studied or personally investigated. The Oklahoma City bombing case is the biggest cover-up in American history. Mark it. I used to say for the first couple of years it was the biggest cover-up since the Kennedy assassinations of the 60s and King. But I go beyond that now, because at least in those years, you could at least get some people to ask, I'm talking about credible reporters from the establishment media, at least they would ask intelligent questions and question, how could Oswald have stood in that window and fired 3 shots in 6 seconds? And why did he wait until Kennedy and the limousine were behind the tree? Why didn't he shoot them when they were coming right at him? Good questions. You know, what was Jack Ruby doing in the police station on Friday night? What was the President of the United States calling the hospital at Parkland Hospital when Dr. Crenshaw has Lee Oswald on the operating table bleeding to death? And why is there a mysterious character in there in a trench coat with a bulge in his coat standing in the operating room? And why at that time does President Lyndon Johnson call Dr. Crenshaw at Parkland and say, we've got to have a deathbed confession? These are all things that were questions that were asked. I defy you to get one peep out of them on Oklahoma City. You can't get them to question anything. And yet anyone who looks at the case, I mean, an 8th grade kid could have looked at that building and seen that a truck on the street could not wreak that kind of havoc. I mean, here you got a truck on the street, and you got the Journal Record building over here, 80 feet through the parking lot on the other side of the street, and you got the Murrah building here, and yet you find debris from the Murrah building over here in the Journal Record building. I got witnesses who watched it blow through. Now, can you tell me how a bomb can blow up here and tear the face off that and blow stuff over here? Or does it make more sense that the building blew from the inside out? And if you walk downtown Oklahoma City today, it still looks like Beirut in many places. I'm talking about pockmarked buildings 3 and 4 blocks away. Ammonium nitrate fuel oil simply cannot do that. It cannot destroy reinforced concrete and steel. And that was already proven to you. You probably forgot it, but it was proven to you with the New York Trade Center bombing, February 26th, 1993. They actually pulled the truck. It's supposed to have had the same amount, 4,800 pounds in it. They actually pulled the truck into the encapsulated basement right up next to a column and detonated it, and it wouldn't take the column out there. If it had, it would have killed 100,000 people, by the way. It would have dumped those two twin towers into each other. As it was, 6 people were killed, and 40 or 50 seriously injured, and another couple of hundred got smoke inhalation and that sort of stuff. But you know what they found out? They found out the American people don't give a damn what happens in New York. That's why they had to go to the heartland. And it's true, we really don't, do we? In most cases. But the FBI got stung. A lot of you may not know this, but you can, check it in the October, in your archives, October 1993, New York Times. It's right there, I think toward the end of the month, 26th or 8th or 9th. The whole story is told, how the FBI paid this Middle Easterner $1 million. They paid him to do this. They were telling him that the thing was just going to be a setup. They were trying to sting these guys. And it was just, he was just to put some blank powder in there, some flour or something, because it would not, would not explode. Well, the Middle Eastern guy, I forget his name now, stung the FBI agents by recording them. And they got the whole $1 million offer on tape to pay off the whole bit. Do the American people care? I mean, the FBI instigated that thing from the start, paid $1 million to blow up the Trade Center, lied to the guy saying it wouldn't be blown up, and then they slipped the stuff in there. Now, are we to doubt that they did this at the Murrah building? We got to be pretty naive. So anyway, I'll try to go into more detail on that case. But I wanted to tell you, well, I was the only journalist to interview the Montana Freeman in 1996. Chuck called me. I was in Dallas on a Monday, and I was be there the next night. He said, "How soon can you get to Montana?" It was in May of '96. I said, "Well, I got a talk to make in Dallas tomorrow night, and then I could leave Wednesday morning, I guess, from here." He said, "Go." He said, "Get us the truth of what's going on up there, because I don't like what I'm smelling." And sure enough, he was right. And we went on the radio every day, sometimes twice a day. And I was telling the Freeman side of the story, and I'll get into more of that when we have a chance. But I want to tell you in closing about the news media cover-up, and maybe why it ties into Tesla and his whole history. 3 incidents. In August of '95, I was working with another investigative reporter by the name of J.D. Cash. Cash is on our video. And he had been writing lots of stories for this little paper in southeastern Oklahoma, this county paper where he was from, about John Doe 2. Now, you may remember John Doe 2 was the most sought-after American, had a $2 million price tag on his head. No one had ever had a reward like this. I was in May of actually late April of '95, and by June the 10th, Janet Reno goes on television and says, John Doe 2 is no longer wanted. He doesn't exist. Well, I'll tell you why he doesn't exist. He doesn't exist because the government had already gotten him out of the country and had to do away with him. He's laying down there in a bar drinking Cuba Libras and smoking a cigar in Rio somewhere, watching all this stuff on TV about 24 hours after it happened, or wherever they sent him. But at the same time, Cash and other private investigators in Oklahoma City had a dozen or more witnesses that had seen John Doe 2, the dark-skinned, Middle Eastern-looking guy with the baseball cap. They'd seen him with McVeigh and McDonald's. They saw him smoking together in a bar, and they saw him at the 7-Eleven. Over a dozen witnesses, and yet Janet says he doesn't exist. Well, Cash is writing these stories in his county paper down there. It's pretty illuminating stuff. And his editor is putting it on the wire, but it's never going national. So we happen to be in Oklahoma City at the same time, and he goes by the bureau chief of Associated Press. And he says, "How come you're not running my stuff?" The editor says he's putting it on the wire. She says, "Well, the FBI was by here a few weeks ago, and they told us not to run anything more on John Doe 2 because he doesn't exist." Now think about that. Here you got the national police telling the national news media what to print. That's very, very dangerous. That's Nazi Germany, 1938 style. And then in '96, I was in Montana, as I mentioned, and I was in Jordan the first day I was up there, and I spent just 2 or 3 days in Jordan before I went back to Billings. But I was in the cafe up there. CBS had commandeered this little cafe, and they had the dining room in the back, and we just had the coffee shop in front. There's a payphone over here on the wall, and it was early. It was about 7 in the morning. I was just snooping around and talking to people, and phone rings, and nobody was payphone, and nobody was there to answer it, so I went over and picked it up. And it was Tom Kasky, the bureau chief from Helena, Associated Press. He was looking for one of his stringers. And there was no one there, but he asked who I was, and I told him, and we rapped a little while, and just kind of made friends on the phone, and I found out who he was, and that was it. Until I was back in Billings a few days later, and I had his toll-free number to call him on, and something I wanted to ask about, some detail, and I called him and got that information, and I said, hey, by the way, Tom, I said, when are you going to have your clowns down here start reporting the truth on this Montana Freeman story instead of just becoming parrots for the government? I said, all they do is take stuff that comes off the indictment or comes off out of the prosecutor's mouth. They don't have any idea. They haven't interviewed any of the Freemen to talk about the truth, you know, their side of the story. He said, well, I know exactly what you're talking about, Pat. He says, sometimes I'll write a story on Saturday and I'll fire it into New York, and by the time I see it in the Billings Gazette on Sunday, I wonder who wrote it. There it is right there under my byline, but I wonder who wrote it. And so I began to imagine, you know, how many or how few people are disseminating the news up there for 260 million of us to read. How few people are actually programming us. And in 1998, in August, my first assignment with Media Bypass, I was in North Carolina on the Eric Rudolph chase. You remember Eric Rudolph? Eric Rudolph was supposed to be the mad bomber that blew up an aborticide down in Birmingham, and since then they've hung all the Atlanta bombings on him and everything, you know, back to the Lincoln assassination that they could think of to hang on him. I still can't find him, though. There are many people, by the way, in Andrews, North Carolina, in that area of western North Carolina, that believe that the whole thing was a sham, that they never thought that Rudolph was in the area, but this was their excuse to come in with 200 agents and commandeer a warehouse and set up a whole spy system on the people, because that part of North Carolina is one of the patriot Christian strongholds in America, one of the strongest of all. Well, be that as it may, because I'm not sure, I don't put it past him, but I'm not sure whether Eric's up in the mountains. I suspect if I were in his position, I would have been long gone after they spotted me in July of '98. No way I would have stuck around there. I would suspect if he's smart, he's up in Alaska or Seattle in the Northwest or somewhere, or maybe even in Central America. But nevertheless, that weekend we were there with Bo Greitz and his spikers. Were trying to lure Eric out and collect $1 million reward and give it to his mother for his defense. Kind of a harebrained scheme, but if it worked, it would have been a good one. It didn't. But there was a news conference that Saturday morning at about noontime or so, and we were standing out in the parking lot afterwards. And I was talking with a CNN cameraman, and I was talking with the guy from Charlotte News Observer, and a guy from UPI, 4 or 5 of us, and I told him about the Oklahoma City thing, a little bit about, you know, 4 bombs being in the building and the impotence of ANFO to do that kind of job. And their mouths were agape. They didn't have a clue. None of these people do investigative reporting anymore. They do what comes off the wire, and they write it and they publish it. And they had never heard these things. I said, you never heard that? What kind of barrel you been sleeping under? I said, this is common knowledge, and I'm not telling you anything that ABC and NBC and CBS don't have, because we sent it to all of them. But it's called suppression of news. Well, then I told them about cash going to the bureau chief at Associated Press and them refusing to print it because the FBI told them not to. This one little guy standing there, this little reporter, he says, wow. He said, that scares me more than the bombs in the buildings. I said, good, it should. It should. And there's a guy standing there, he's wearing a UPI badge. I said, you with United Press International? He said, yeah. I said, my gosh, I said, I thought you guys were dead and gone. I thought you were out of business. I never see your byline anymore. He said, well, you're right. He said, we only get about 5% of the market anymore. Associated Press gets more than 90%. And I began to think after that conversation about my conversation with Tom and Helena and the bureau chief in Oklahoma City. And Associated Press gets more than 90% of the coverage. So I imagine a dozen or so people up there disseminating the news. No, they can't hear that. Yeah, that's good. Let's let them hear that one. No, that's not good. Yeah, let's do this one. And probably the same way at CNN, probably the same way in the Washington offices, maybe in Atlanta. So I guess my bottom line with all this is, don't believe what you read in the papers. And don't believe it, if you see it on the news, understand that you're listening to government propaganda. It's not always lies. No, I don't mean to say that. But it's always going to have the government slant. And it's never going to be in the slant of liberty and constitutional rights and anything that applies to the people. So anyhow, when I was flying back from Montana, I realized I was the only guy in the country who had this story. And I guess I figured I'd better write a book about it, which I did. And it's called The Montana Freeman, The Untold Story of Government Suppression and the News Media Cover-Up. And there's a 19-page document in here in the back that really is worth the paltry $10 price of the book. You may remember that in April of that year, Greitz and McLam came out very frustrated. They couldn't get the Freeman to come out because Bo never understood the Freeman stand. But one day he came out about his last try, and he had a 19-page document in his hand, and he had a videotape in the other hand. And he handed the document to the FBI agent in charge. He handed the tape to the cameraman with ABC. And he looked right at the camera. He said, "Here's your chance, Janet Reno, to behave lawfully instead of forcefully this time," with an obvious reference to Waco. And he said, here's the Freeman's information. He says, "You show them how they're wrong, and they'll come out tomorrow." Now, I think that's a pretty fair offer, don't you? Hey, if we're wrong and you're right, then we'll come out. Show us where we are. But they never did. They never responded to that. And the FBI agent, by the way, confiscated the video from the cameraman also, which was unlawful to do so without a warrant. And the cameraman should have resisted that, but he didn't. Anyway, I was lucky enough later to commandeer a copy of that 19-page Freeman stand, and it's here in the appendix printed in the back of the book. So I urge you to come along to the bookstore and come say hello to me and see some of our back issues of the magazine. And I hope you'll be enthusiastic enough to want to subscribe and learn some of the uncensored news that's going on in America. I think we've got some kind of mix and type thing going on, a little social coming up in so it's 9 o'clock, so let us do that, and I hope to get a chance to meet you personally as well. And I'll see you later in the weekend. Thank you. Hi.